Hi, I'm New York Times Metro reporter Jeff May sitting in for Sam Roberts. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, we'll discuss a survey of how New Yorkers are feeling these days about living in the city. Concerns over quality of life have got many residents considering a move. But first, New York's legal weed rollout. Things finally came to a head this week as Governor Hochul called for a comprehensive review of the licensing process. Her announcement comes after she abruptly suspended a Cannabis Control Board meeting at the beginning of the year. Hochul has become increasingly frustrated by licensing delays and the rise in illegal dispensaries. And there have also been lawsuits. New York Times reporter Ashley Southall covers cannabis legalization in New York, and she joins us now. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for coming on. I'm so glad I finally got you. So we have a bit of news here. Kathy Hochul, a couple of days ago, made an announcement about changing or reviewing the legal process for receiving a cannabis license. What happened?
Yeah, so for the last year, New York's cannabis rollout has been tied up in various delays, whether it's the lawsuits or the rollout of the regulations or getting the financing for the first dispensaries to go online. And this year, all of that is sort of cleared out, and there's nothing holding back the program. But we don't see the businesses getting licensed as quickly as one might expect after waiting for so long. And so the governor's frustrated. She's like, what's the holdup now? And what's happening is that businesses that are applying are just sort of meeting a very complicated process where you might ask the same question through two different people and get different answers. You might see different interpretations of regulations or rules. And so it's very confusing, and there's a lot of money on the line. There's also a lot of real estate on the line with these dispensaries in particular, which are sort of the last phase of the rollout. Once they find a location, needed to secure it quickly, get it approved, and they have to secure it before somebody else secures another location that might knock that location out of contention because there are rules as to how close these things can be to each other, to churches, to schools. So it's a real battle, and there's a lot of money that businesses are hemorrhaging, and at the same time, these businesses aren't opening as quickly as they need to.
So who's leading the process of this review, and what are the ultimate goals? Is there going to be a report produced? What's going to happen after the review?
Right, so the governor appointed Commissioner Jeanette Moore, who oversees the Office of General Services. And they typically do these reviews at agencies when they're looking to clear backlogs or to streamline processes, which is exactly what they want to happen here. So over the next 30 days, she's going to be embedded with the Office of Cannabis Management, which handles the licensing process. They take the licenses in, they review the locations and things like that. And she's going to see where there's room for improvement, and most importantly, the governor wants a dashboard where her office can see okay, what's going on with these licenses in real time, and other states have similar processes. We have to remember that the Office of Cannabis Management was very hastily put together. They were trying to do this quickly, and they've done a lot in the last 2 years, but now there's a real desire for something that people can know what they're getting into when they walk into the room with their application.
Now, Governor Hochul has called this process a disaster, her words, yeah. But she's not blameless in this. Is her office blameless in this? What could the governor's office and the state have done better to not have us in this current predicament?
Well, we have to remember that when legalization passed in New York, cannabis was on an upswing. There was lots of money, there were lots of people getting into cannabis because the demand was there. However, when the pandemic went away and workers started going back to the office, they couldn't hide their cannabis use as much anymore. And so you see a drop in demand, but it's not so much that the industry has gone away. And Governor Hochul, she comes in after her predecessor resigns in disgrace, and she's getting her government together, so she just leaves the Office of Cannabis Management to do their thing. She signs on to this program that seems to be a good idea, letting people who were arrested for marijuana or who were in some ways impacted by that to open the first dispensaries. But there are lots of people who were also waiting for the opportunity who were not happy with that and decided to sue. And that's part of where the state went wrong, where many people believe the state went wrong, but also the government also tried to fund and lease the first dispensary stores And they met sort of the same challenges that they were trying to solve for the dispensaries, which is that it's very hard to get financing. It's very hard to secure real estate because cannabis is federally illegal. So they ended up being blocked by the challenges, and some of those were the governor's decisions.
Have we seen many new licenses rolling out this year, or is there an expected number that we've seen, and has it fallen beneath that?
Yeah, well, we've actually seen about 50 new dispensaries open this year, which is a really good pace for the Office of Cannabis Management after the sort of trickle of stores last year. The first store opened at the end of 2022 at the very end. Then we had like 30 open last year, and now the state is moving at a pace. But the governor seems to think that we can move a little faster, and she and many people agree with her that, you know, at their first meeting this year, the cannabis regulators were only prepared to issue about 5 licenses, and the governor said, no way. Like, we need to see more than that. So this process will help to, and they did issue 100 more in February, but the governor's like, let's move this along. Right. Let's see if we can do better.
But I mean, as any New Yorker can tell you who's walked down the street, there are dozens of dispensaries. Those are not licensed dispensaries, right? And so the question is, why are there so many of these unlicensed dispensaries?
Yeah, well, there's people who see money and they want to get a piece of it, right? And there are people who are willing to flout the rules. They don't really see anyone coming after them. You know, when the police, or I'm sorry, when the sheriff's office or the Office of Cannabis Management or tax comes into your store, it's going to take them. We've seen cases take as long as a year to get resolved. So, you know, that's time where you can make money, and it's probably gonna you're probably gonna make more than you lose in the process. So they see it as a cost of doing business. But what the state is really looking to go after is those landlords who are leasing to these spaces, because without the landlords offering their space, there's no stores.
And I mean, the point of the program is to also produce tax revenue, right? So I'm wondering, is the number of illegal dispensaries, is it hurting that effort to actually, you know, use cannabis to produce tax revenue?
I'll give you some numbers. We have about 85 dispensaries, licensed dispensaries, that have gone through the painstaking process of following the rules. But we have, in New York City alone, about 2,000 smoke shops that are selling cannabis illegally. And people don't know where it comes from. It may be tainted, it's not tested, and there are real concerns about copper and lead in those stores. So it's a real problem, and they're cutting into revenues. We see stores open, and they have, you know, anywhere between 2 and 60 dispensaries within a 5-block radius. And consumers in some places either don't know or don't care about the difference. And those tax revenues that are attached to the cannabis law, it's about 13% total local and sales tax. That's meant to go toward undoing some of the harm of the war on drugs, which really ravaged Black and brown communities, especially in New York City. And the unlicensed shops don't pay that. Some of them pay the sales tax that goes into the general fund. That doesn't go toward the specific aims of legalization in New York.
Wow, that's incredible. 2,000 in New York City alone versus 80
That's the latest
sort
estimate.
of legalized ones. You know, Mayor Eric Adams has taken up this issue. He's complained about it a lot. Why can't the mayor just go in and shut these illegal dispensaries down?
Right. Well, it's a time-consuming process, for one. The mayor would like this to fall under the jurisdiction of the police because they're a bigger agency, they have a lot more manpower and resources to go after these shops. The mayor does have different powers that he could use to go after these shops, and we've seen it in some instances. I've seen stores around my home being shut down by the Department of Consumer and Workforce Protection. We've seen the sheriff's office, which is the main agency in the city, go after these shops, but they raid these shops, and then within a few hours or a few days, they're back open because they have to go through the process of adjudicating these cases, and they can't just throw a padlock on the stores. So he's looking for more power to just shut them down right away, and that proposal's really it's really gained popularity in the legislature, and it's something that is probably going to make it in the budget.
I know there's state legislation that would allow that. Do you know what's the status of that? Does it have any chance of passing this session?
Yeah, they all three proposals from the governor, the Senate, and the Assembly, they all have some form of enforcement that allows local governments to go after both the shops and the landlords. And we've seen across the state that some places are very much willing to do so. In Rockland County, for instance, we saw raids just last week where they brought in the Department of Homeland Security, which deals with money laundering issues, but that took them over a year. New York doesn't want to wait that long. They want these shops gone right now, and Mayor Eric Adams in particular feels that the police are a crucial part of doing so.
One question with the legal dispensaries, there are rules, right? You guidelines for who can enter, like children, underage children can't just go in. Those don't seem to be in place with the illegal dispensaries. What protections are in place if we are to see a sort of increase in legal dispensaries, a decrease in legal dispensaries? Are there protections in place for children, for example, underage children?
Right. Yeah, you're right that with the unlicensed shops, there's no rules. It's just the money grab. And we see in some instances that children go into these stores. There's candy that looks like Skittles. And there's even snacks in some of these stores. In a regulated store and a licensed store that's taken the time to follow the rules, number one, the first thing you have to do is provide ID. If you're not 21, get out of here. And you won't see the packaging that's like brightly labeled or cartoon murals and neon lights. That sort of stuff is not allowed in New York City. And what's happened is that's fueling part of the frustration with the rollout is that the licensed places look like the illicit dispensaries and the unlicensed ones are the ones that people think are legit. So they're kind of stuck in a really harmful dynamic that's hurting them. And they want to be freed of some of these rules.
I want to go back to what's happening with the state. There were some issues there, right? There have been complaints from people who have tried to follow the legal process and open up dispensaries. Tell me about that. What's going on with the office itself?
Right. Well, the biggest issue has been this issue called site protection. So once you have a provisional license, or if you have real estate, you have to get it protected. So that means that when you secure a location, you have to make sure that within a certain distance, there are no schools, there are no churches, and there are no other dispensaries. And that's just each time a location is secured, that eliminates possibly hundreds of other locations, especially in a dense city like New York. And so you have to, there's on the map, applicants have seen like different locations that are reserved that are actually illicit shops. They've seen places that are reserved that are close to schools and churches that are knocking them out of contention. And they've also seen that the places that they thought they had reserved aren't on the map and they aren't protected. And at the same time, they're paying for some of these spaces. They either have leases or letters of intent. And so they're losing money and they want this process to go faster. They want to have a yes or no on their licenses and locations as soon as possible so they can make some money.
You mentioned earlier the equity requirements in licensing, and this is a way to sort of resolve some of the harm that was done with marijuana prosecutions. Where are we at with that? How many of these legal dispensaries are, equitable or run by people of color or people who have been harmed by marijuana prosecution in the past?
Yeah, so all of the dispensaries that have opened at this point are either run by someone who has been arrested for cannabis at the state level or who had a parent or brother or partner who was arrested. One young woman in Queens at Good Grades, her father was deported over marijuana charges. And a gentleman on the Lower East Side, he spent time in prison over marijuana charges. So everyone who's opened so far has some experiences. Now we're starting to see general licensees come on who have not had those experiences. And so that is expanding. But one of the things that the state likes to tout is that there are more dispensaries in New York that are owned by people impacted by the criminalization of cannabis than anywhere else in the country.
Tell me your expectations finally for the next year. Is this going to turn around? Is there a model somewhere that New York should be following, or are we sort of blazing a trail here with how we're implementing this program?
The Office of Cannabis Management likes to say they're building the plane while they fly it. What New York tried to do here is really ambitious with its equity goals, trying to make sure that this is a market that's dominated by small businesses and that people who were doing this when it was criminalized also can do it while it's legal. In other states, what we've seen is companies that run medical programs being allowed to be the first to sell. And in places, for instance, like Florida, they've dominated the market. They completely control it. In Massachusetts, we see some mix, and in New Jersey, we see as well some mix. But by and large, a lot of dispensaries are owned by companies that are multi-state operators. In New York, they want cannabis to be a New York brand because it is a very New York culture.
Ashley, thanks for coming in. We look forward to your continuing coverage of this issue. Coming up next, have New Yorkers finally soured on the Big Apple? Is New York better off than it was 7 years ago? In a survey conducted recently by the nonpartisan Citizens Budget Commission, New York residents were asked about their satisfaction with the city, and their responses showed a stark contrast to previous years. Across nearly all aspects of living in the 5 boroughs, New Yorkers see urban life deteriorating. New York Times Metro reporter Dana Rubinstein covers city politics and government. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on. You wrote about this survey. What did it say? Was it surprising?
I think what was surprising was the really steep drop-off in sentiment amongst New York City residents. So they, fewer than a third think the quality of life in New York City is good or excellent. 7 years ago, that was 50% of people who thought it was good or excellent. Same for 2008 when they did a similar survey. And that was kind of the trend in nearly every metric that they measured, that New Yorkers are really dissatisfied with New York City, how it's being run, how their tax dollars are being spent, sanitation, just really across the board.
So it's just quality of life as a whole, or was there one particular issue that stood out? Crime, for example.
Crime did stand out. People seem to be really worried about crime. The number of people who feel safe in the subway during the day is, I think, less than 50%, and that's sort of on par with the percentage of people who felt safe on the subway during the night 7 years ago. So people just, they don't feel safe, they don't believe government is working well for them, and they're just dissatisfied with their quality of life in New York generally.
So New York City is a city of neighborhoods, right? Did people in the Bronx feel the same way as people in Park Slope?
What's interesting is that people felt similarly, regardless of neighborhood, about quality of life writ large. But in their specific neighborhoods, there were very striking distinctions. So the neighborhood or the community board where residents seemed happiest with quality of life was Community Board 6, which encompasses wealthy, largely white neighborhoods like Park Slope and Carroll Gardens. And then the neighborhood that sort of rated the worst was in the Bronx. I believe it was Community Board 5 in the Bronx, which includes South Fordham, and where people just, responded. There were 4 ways you could grade your neighborhood: excellent, good, fair, poor, and they had the highest poor ranking amongst all of the different community board districts.
And were there specific indications as to why they saw their neighborhood as being poor?
Well, I spoke with the council member who represents that neighborhood, Karina Sanchez, and she really pointed to crime and also just the socioeconomic factors that make life more difficult to live. And Bronx is the poorest borough in the city and the poorest county in the state, and life is harder when you don't have resources.
So I assume this is still, maybe this is what Bill de Blasio talked about for 8 years. Is this still about inequality in the city?
I think the Tale of Two Cities is alive and well, for sure. And, I think there's also just a general impression that things in New York are not as good as they should be.
I'm wondering, did the survey at all discuss who New Yorkers blame for this? Are they happy with government services? Are they not happy with policing?
It didn't get into politics, but they did talk about government services and which ones they are more or less content with. They seemed relatively content with, the FDNY, EMS, parks, but other services, including public education, after-school programs, the government's use of tax dollars were less well received.
Right. I mean, New York has always been a destination city to me. A lot of people come here and they want to start their lives. But what I found interesting in the survey was it seemed like a huge chunk of people thought about leaving the city.
Yeah, half of the respondents, and there were more than 6,600 respondents, said they were planning to leave the city within the next 5 years, which is an increase from prior years. I mean, we can all dream, right? But, that doesn't mean they will actually leave. But
Right.
yeah, people clearly yearned for a better life, but are, wedded to the city because that's where their job is, or their family is, or their kids go to school.
Right. And is this related at all, do you think, to the pandemic, right? The city did go through a troubled, difficult period during the pandemic.
Probably, right? I mean, that was a totally unsettling event, years-long event that we're only now just coming out of. So it's hard to imagine it's not related. And, the head of the CBC did also note that in 2017, the last time the survey was done, we were in more of sort of an economic boom. So yeah, I'm sure that's a factor. I'm sure there's all sorts of contributing factors, right? Our current mayor ran for office on the premise that New York City was out of control. And now we are all dealing with that perception, and perhaps he was more effective than intended at creating that impression.
Mayor Adams has said the city is back, that the city is doing a great job of recovering from the pandemic. This survey seems to sort of dispute that notion.
Yeah, I asked him about it on Tuesday during the Q&A, and he noted that he's only been in office for 2 of the last 7 years, so the drop-off that does encompass 7 years is not relegated only to his mayoralty. And he noted COVID, and he often notes the migrant crisis as something that New Yorkers are aware of. So, it's a mixed bag. There's also the distinction between sentiment and reality. It's a complicated question.
One of the issues that was raised in the survey, people talked about feeling safe on the subway. We know that mental illness on the subway, mentally ill people on the subway, has been an issue. Was that addressed at all in the survey?
I'd have to look. I don't remember a specific metric about mentally ill on the subway. I do think there was a metric about mental health care generally, but I don't remember the precise number. But yeah, that's definitely an issue that is apparently intractable. I mean, how many times have you and I gone to or watched press conferences with the mayor and the governor talking about their latest plan to deal with subway safety? Right. And then a few months later, we go to another conference about the same thing.
Right. And so CBC, why conduct this survey? What's their goal with it?
I think, I think they would say that it is important to understand how New Yorkers feel so that you can guide policy to address how New Yorkers feel. I mean, they're nonpartisan, but also fiscally fairly conservative organization. So I think, the inclusion of a question about how New York City government uses its resources and whether New Yorkers are content with that was sort of tied into its mission, and New Yorkers are not, by and large, content with how New York City spends its money. But this was originally a survey in 2008 that New York City itself conducted, and then when it didn't do a repeat in 2017, the Citizens Budget Commission took over. So I think they just felt it was time to sort of reappraise conditions.
They did give the mayor some credit, right? I believe they did credit him for, his crime-fighting agenda, that sort of thing.
They credited him for targeting his agenda toward the things that New Yorkers are concerned about, which he himself noted repeatedly during the Tuesday press conference. And but they did not credit him for actually achieving that which he is intending to achieve.
We have an election coming up soon. It feels like election season is gearing up. How do you think these sort of survey results might affect whether people decide to challenge Mayor Adams or not?
I think they embolden potential challengers. I mean, how could they not? Same goes for the polls that shows popularity numbers in the tank. I think, it's just, there's a steady drumbeat of emboldening news. And I think we're likely to see a real primary in 2025.
My last question on this, does CBC have any sort of reason for optimism in spite of these sort of declining numbers? Or is there, did Mayor Adams present any reasons to be optimistic in spite of how New Yorkers are feeling at the moment?
Well, our job numbers are up, and while there are crime issues, they're nothing like they were a couple decades ago. So there are reasons for optimism, but as he also likes to note, perception is different from reality, and New Yorkers are grumpy.
I was going to say that. I want to pivot quickly and
Sure.
just ask you a bit about Mayor Adams. He spent a lot of time this week denying allegations that he sexually assaulted a former colleague in 1993. What happened, and what are those allegations about?
I'm not sure we'll ever know what precisely happened, but this complainant, you know, as part of the Adult Survivors Act, was able to file a lawsuit alleging he sexually assaulted her when he was running the Guardians, which was the organization for African American police officers, and she was working for the department and sought his help because she was having trouble getting promoted, felt like she was being discriminated against, and she said that he used that opportunity and her vulnerability to try to get her to do something that she didn't want to do. The allegations are very specific, and you know, it's a lot, very explicit. And yeah, I mean, I guess it's likely to play out in court at some point.
The
He
mayor
is
has
denying them. You know, he said he doesn't recall ever meeting her. This never happened. He says it's completely at odds with how he comports himself around people, and you know, and he has apologized to his family for the fact that they have to read about these allegations, you know, in the press.
The mayor's being defended by the city's corporation counsel,
Yes.
legal counsel, but some people have raised questions about that.
Yeah, I spoke with this Columbia law professor, Richard Briffault, who used to run the chair of the Conflicts of Interest Board for New York City, and he says it's seemingly quite inappropriate. Apparently, the corporation counsel is really only supposed to defend you for things you're accused of while performing your official duties, and this would not seem to fall under that definition. But the corp counsel has a different argument, and it does seem like they do have some discretion in the matter, whether it's inappropriate seeming or not.
Great. Dana, thanks for coming in. We look forward to your reporting on how politicians are reacting to the survey. That's it for today's show. Thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Mays, filling in for Sam Roberts. Join us again next week on CUNY TV.